tonight is the alleged execution that has elevated now into a full-blown foreign policy crisis for President Trump. The alleged Saudi kidnapping, interrogation, and execution of a U.S. resident, Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, has now taken a turn. This is new today, with Donald Trump going full double-down defense of the Saudi Arabian regime. And that is, of course, amidst new gruesome reports about what the Saudis allegedly did to Khashoggi. Now, a warning before I go any further. The account is disturbing, but experts say this is important. This is the context for the mounting pressure within this country and across the world on the Trump administration to address Saudi Arabia's alleged actions rather than cover for it. So here are the details. A senior Turkish official confirming that Turkish media reports on information that the New York Times has recounting audio recordings showing the Saudis severed Khashoggi's fingers during the interrogation while he was still alive. This taking place within the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, according to the reports. Then they beheaded and dismembered him. And as they did it, a doctor of forensic who was part of the team told the others to listen to music to ease the tension in that room. Saudi officials still deny involvement. 9 of the 15 suspects, though, have history working with the Saudi government, including the man in this photo here who frequently traveled with the Crown Prince. He was in Houston this year, as you can see. Now, Donald Trump is certainly not the first U.S. president to coddle Saudi Arabia despite actions against U.S. interests and values. George W. Bush was classifying portions of the 9/11 report that investigated the financial ties between the Saudi regime and those hijackers. Or take the Obama administration. They didn't let their public criticism of Saudi policy prevent the largest weapon sales by the U.S. to that country on record. But Donald Trump is going way further now, comparing this alleged torture and murder in the embassy to his own American Supreme Court pick. Look at this, brand new. Quote, "You know, here we go again. You're guilty until proven innocent. I don't like that. We just went through that with Justice Kavanaugh, and he was innocent all the way." Trump also casting doubt on reports of the audio evidence of this killing.
Why not send the FBI in to figure all this out?
Well, he wasn't a citizen of this country, for one thing, and we're going to determine that. And you don't know whether or not we have, do you?
Well,
No, but do you know whether or not we've sent the FBI?
Have you sent the FBI?
I'm not going to tell you.
You asked for this audio, video intelligence that deterrence.
We have asked for it. If it exists, we have asked for it.
If it exists, while Trump fanning the flames of a kind of conspiracy there, suggesting the audio has been widely reported but may not exist, well, his Secretary of State was far more blunt when it comes to this alleged torture and murder. He said straight up, the Trump administration doesn't really want to discuss the facts.
They say that Mr. Khashoggi is alive or dead.
I don't want to talk about any of the facts. They didn't want to either, and that they want to have the opportunity to complete this investigation in a thorough way.
Kicking off our coverage, Bill Kristol, founder and editor-at-large of the Weekly Standard, and Jason Johnson from TheRoot.com. Bill, when you look at this response, as I mentioned, not the first time the U.S. Has given the Saudis a pass on things that are very objectionable, but this does seem of another order.
Oh, yeah, sending the Secretary of State there almost as a supplicant. He's then yucking it up with the King and the Crown Prince, and the State Department spokeswoman is putting on Instagram, I think it was, photos of herself as kind of a happy tourist in Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's terrible. I mean, what's happened is really awful. It requires a serious response, in my judgment. A serious administration would be having meetings about different grades of response and discussing that, not trying to deflect and really participate. I mean, Trump is part of the Saudi cover-up at this point, and they're sort of working together
to try to decide how
little they can.
You'd go that far? You think he is an active part of this cover-up?
I say he's an active part of trying to figure out how to minimize any damage to U.S.-Saudi relations. How little can the Saudis admit and get away with it? Can they blame junior officials? I mean, he's setting the ground. He's laying the groundwork for the most minimal kind of concessions by the Saudis, and then I think for the most minimal actions by the U.S. Now, look, if you want to make some people want to make a policy case that this is awful, what's happened. Saudis have done other awful things. They're fighting an awful war in Yemen, but we have national interests at stake, et cetera, and let's have a policy debate. But that's not what Trump is doing. Trump is just trying to muddy the waters enough. It's very much like what he does with Mueller and in domestic policy, so that he doesn't have to do much, because he doesn't want to do anything. He really doesn't want to do anything, I think, in return for this ghastly murder. You know, they seduce, they lure him to the consulate there, murder this man in the most gruesome way, and Trump doesn't want to do anything about it.
Right, and to state the obvious, Bill, although that's part of our job these days, there is nothing tough in foreign policy or the world stage about letting another country get away with, as you put it, the gruesome murder of a U.S. resident and journalist.
Right, and a leading dissident in that country, in a place that's allegedly liberalizing. But, of course, it's similar to his attitude towards Putin, towards China, towards Xi, who's got 1 million Uyghurs and virtual concentration camps. To say that human rights isn't a priority anymore is such an understatement. We don't even seem able to act in a sort of dignified way. If we're not going to act on behalf of democracy, human rights, freedom, decency, sometimes you can in foreign policy, I suppose, and people can do that. But then act with a certain kind of dignity and decency. Don't send the Secretary of State over there to yuck it up with the King of Saudi Arabia.
Jason, as you know, there are many, many stories where we report out the total quiet and quiescence of Republican elected officials in the face of things they'd long said they were against when Donald Trump does them. We're also fair, and we report out what we find when we find it. And we did see, and I want to play, several Republican elected officials breaking with the Trump administration over this. Take a look.
Where's the body? Why wasn't the family notified? Why have they spent the better part of 8 or 9 days saying they didn't know anything about it?
I think the Saudis murdered him.
This guy is a wrecking ball. He had this guy murdered in a consulate in Turkey, and to expect me to ignore it, I feel used and abused.
Jason.
I mean, I do declare Lindsey Graham feels used and abused and again. But here's the problem. A lot of Republicans will criticize Trump, and they won't do anything. They won't hold up any policy. They won't enact any sort of changes. While they are still running the House and Senate, they will not do anything to really hold Saudi Arabia accountable. And you have to remember, this is a situation where you have several bad actors. I mean, we have Turkey, who, you know, they had, you know, officials over here beating American protesters a year ago, and the president didn't do anything about it. They have their own bad history with journalists. So, you know, you have sort of a feckless Republican Party that will complain. You have several bad actors who have been emboldened by this president. And what concerns me, and what should concern any journalist or anybody who cares about American democracy and decency and honesty, is this will not be the only time this happens. I mean, Jamal Khashoggi was a permanent resident, but this will end up happening to Americans. This will end up happening to other countries who have journalists who we're allied with. Because when the President of the United States has basically declared war on the press in the United States and specific news outlets, other dictators will be perfectly comfortable in engaging in these kinds of activities because they know there's no consequence.
It makes a lot of sense when you lay it out like that, although it's certainly discouraging. Both of you stay with me. On the diplomacy, we want to now turn to an expert we rely on many stories, Evelyn Farkas, who is Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary. Before we get to what's wrong with this, being familiar with some of your analysis, I think you might echo some of what we've heard on the morality. I wonder if you could just walk us through, at a geostrategic level, why is Saudi Arabia considered so important to the U.S.?
Well, Ari, Saudi Arabia has always been important to the United States because, of course, historically, we've gotten the bulk of our oil from Saudi Arabia, not just us, but, of course, our allies. So it was important to have a good relationship with Saudi Arabia. They helped us regulate the price, especially when supply fluctuated. They've been helpful to us, of course, in the context of dealing with Russia and other oil suppliers. However, many people point out that they did put the squeeze on oil prices. They put them low, which hurt our shale oil production. So it's a double-edged sword with the Saudis. We have come to rely on them supposedly for counterterrorism help, although, of course, if you look at 9/11, all the perpetrators of that, and Osama bin Laden himself was Saudi. The Wahhabi branch of Islam is coming from Saudi Arabia, so the Saudi government over the years has essentially allowed their clerics to spread a very fundamental version of Islam worldwide, which has caused problems for the world. This current crown prince, who was ruling essentially while his father was still on the throne, but essentially running Saudi Arabia, said he was going to reform that, and we like that. But the reality is that Saudi Arabia is a little less important, should have been less important to us today. And so just to wrap up, under the Trump administration, it became more important. Saudi Arabia became more important because the Trump administration said, in the geostrategic context of the Middle East, we are going to throw our weight towards Saudi Arabia because we hate Iran that much. And the two countries are at loggerheads. They're rivals. It has to do with religion and geopolitics. And so we threw our lot in too heavily with Saudi Arabia. It's better for the United States not to do that, to be more of a balancer, if you will. In the region, I think, writ large, the only ally we really have is Israel there, hard fast in the Middle East. But so we made a calculated mistake, and this guy, the Crown Prince, was, frankly speaking, unreliable. And what he has done makes it clear that we should not be working with Saudi Arabia as closely as we have thus far, so long as he remains the heir apparent and running the country.
And so listening to your very erudite and sort of sobering briefing on the history makes one question how this president makes big decisions. I mean, so much of what he does gets attention for the ways that it breaks norms, that it is depressing, that it is outrageous, the insults. But here we are dealing with something at a far greater level, which listening to you makes quite clear. Does Donald Trump, in your view, have any method for reassessing this bet? I mean, you're saying they put a big bet down on Saudi Arabia instead of Iran. Obama famously was trying to warm relations with Iran and going in a little bit of a different direction. Is there any reassessment? I mean, how many people, to put it bluntly, have to be tortured and killed in extrajudicial killings before the administration says, gosh, these guys are drunk with power, we need to check them more?
There should be a reassessment. The problem, I think, is fundamental at the highest levels, not the cabinet, but the president. He doesn't understand the value of essentially values. He doesn't understand that you can gain power and influence by standing up for human rights, by having a firm policy against extrajudicial, extraterritorial killings of journalists. Because again, as Jamal, I believe, said, this is going to happen again. In another country, another autocrat is going to kill another journalist because the United States is not standing up for the principle. And the rest of the world will notice, and we will lose influence and power.
The rest of the world will notice, and Jason, the rest of the world will hear the power, authority, and leadership of the United States siding with what look increasingly like blatant lies. And I don't use that word every night. I use that when we can prove it. I want to play for your analysis, Jason, how the president sided with Putin's lies and now with what really look like Saudi Arabian lies. First, the Putin denial. Take a look.
I think that the United States has been foolish. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
The king firmly denied any knowledge of it. He didn't really know. Maybe, I don't want to get into his mind, but it sounded to me like maybe these could have been rogue killers. Who knows?
Jason.
Yeah, because 15 rogue killers came in a Saudi plane and managed to get in the embassy. Ari, what this really speaks to is the fact that the president is completely in the pocket of any other dictators in the world because he admires their ability to basically kill or tacitly allow the death of anybody who criticizes them. I don't think the president ever got on the phone with anybody in Saudi Arabia. I don't think he read any sort of, NSA analysis to come to that decision. He basically said, I don't care. It was a brown journalist. He's not an American, and I'm perfectly happy with our relationship with Turkey, and I'm perfectly happy with our relationship with Saudi Arabia.
Do you think, I just want to be clear about what you're saying, you think it might have been different if it was a different person?
Oh, yes. I think there is a possibility. Look, I'm not going to name any particular news networks, but I suspect that if this was someone who was an American who was born here of a different color and perhaps representing a news outlet that the president was more happy with, he may have a very different opinion about how serious this is and whether or not Saudi Arabia should be held accountable.
Right.
And everything in his behavior suggests.
On the one hand, you're making a hypothetical, right? So it's an allegation, it's hypothetical. But on the other hand, as you and other experts have pointed out, we are talking about a president who degrades and attacks journalists in the most extreme ways and talks about them as a quote-unquote enemy of the people inside our very country. And here we are dealing with the execution of someone affiliated with one of those outlets, the Washington Post.
Exactly. And I don't think this president, he clearly is not a fan of journalism. He is not a fan of journalism in the United States, and he's not going to do anything about this. And here's I think, a bigger issue that we have to remember about this. Journalists come to America, just like scholars, just like business people, because they think this country will protect them, because they think we're the land of the free. There will be journalists, there will be investigators around the world who won't come here now because they see how this president allowed this to transpire.
I think it's an important point to consider.
But he also wasn't just a journalist.
I'm over time, so briefly, Bill.
Okay. The Saudis consider him a dissident. Trump has no sympathy with dissidents, whether the dissidents in Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and that's terrible, I think. He is on the side of the dictators against the dissidents.
Dictators against the dissidents. And as you say, Bill, he was someone who had that history, which makes him different than a totally independent reporter. But what, as Jason was saying, was taking the protection that the United States typically affords people to speak their mind, the First Amendment. My thanks to everyone on the panel. A lot of important stuff. Bill, Jason, and Evelyn. Coming up, there are